Welcome to the Deep Dive, where we take the sources you're curious about and really try to extract the knowledge you need in a way that sticks. You, the learner, have posed a classic head-scratcher. How can divine foreknowledge, God knowing everything in advance, actually coexist with our human freedom, our ability to make real choices? So our mission today is to navigate this fascinating intersection using excerpts from Dr. William Lane Craig's, deep dive into this very issue, divine foreknowledge and human freedom. And it's interesting, part of what apparently drove Dr. Craig to write this was a genuine plea for understanding from the philosopher Anthony Kenny. Kenny, who, after being a believer, found himself really struggling with the logical consistency of God. And as we'll see, Dr. Craig tackles this from a whole range of philosophical angles.
Yeah, what's really striking right from the start is that personal context Crank provides. He essentially dedicates the book, in a sense, to Anthony Kenny, emphasizing how sincere Kenny's request was a plaintive supplication, as Craig puts it, for help in understanding how belief in God holds together. That this wasn't just some intellectual game for Kenny, it was a deeply felt struggle, which really underscores how significant these questions are for anyone grappling with faith and reason.
Okay, so before diving into his own approach, Craig sort of surveys the existing landscape of ideas. He points to Stephen Davis's logic and the nature of God as a careful attempt to defend God's attributes through logic.
Hmm.
Though Craig hints that he finds Davis's idea of God's nature being contingent, like it could have been different, maybe a bit unsatisfying.
Right.
He also mentions John Moskop's work, which compares how Aquinas and Hartshorne understood divine omniscience. That sounds interesting, too.
Mm.
Then there's Jonathan Kvanvig's The Possibility of an All-Knowing God, a work Craig clearly respects, and he notes areas of agreement. But he also flags William Hasker's God, Time, and Knowledge as presenting quite different perspectives. So it sounds like there's already a pretty lively debate happening.
Absolutely. If we step back for a moment, what we see is Craig situating his own work within this, long and complex history of philosophical thought about God. By engaging with such a diverse range of views, those that carefully defend theistic coherence and those that raise significant challenges, he's showing just how multifaceted this issue is. It also reminds us that even within a particular intellectual tradition, like the philosophy of theism, there isn't just one way of understanding these core concepts.
Okay, now here's where it gets really interesting, I think. Craig brings in the work of Bergier, who lays out 4 reasons why we might rationally hold beliefs even when they seem maybe logically shaky. These include arguments from established schools of thought like scholasticism, deeply personal intuitive experiences like our feeling of being free or having an immaterial soul.
Right, that inner sense.
Exactly. Then beliefs that are fundamental to how we experience the world, like the reality of an external world or time-passing motion. And finally, beliefs based on testimony from others. And this then leads into Plantinga's concept of intrinsic defeaters.
Okay.
Think of these as beliefs that are so foundational, so basic, that we can rationally keep holding them, even when we face arguments that seem to contradict them. And Craig's key argument here is that belief in God, particularly when it's grounded in what the New Testament calls the inner witness of the Holy Spirit, can function as this kind of bedrock belief, an intrinsic defeater.
That raises a really fundamental question, doesn't it, about how we form and maintain our beliefs. Berger's categories are insightful because they acknowledge, look, not all our beliefs come from step-by-step logical reasoning. Plantinga's idea of an intrinsic defeater then suggests that some beliefs have a kind of built-in resilience. Essentially, some convictions might be so central to how we understand ourselves and reality that we're rational in sticking with them, even if there are intellectual puzzles that seem to undermine them. And Craig's application of this to religious belief suggests a way that faith can be rationally held even in the face of these philosophical challenges.
So if God knows everything, how exactly does that work? Like, what's the mechanism? Craig discusses Jonathan Fanvig's idea that God knows different kinds of things in different ways. For propositions about his own nature, his essence, God has direct understanding. Simple enough, maybe.
Okay, direct grasp.
But for things happening in space and time, like what we're going to have for dinner tomorrow, God's knowledge is indirect. Kvanvig argues this distinction helps resolve potential clashes with the idea that God is timeless and unchanging, immutable.
Ah, okay. So the type of knowledge depends on the object of knowledge.
Exactly. But there's a twist. If God's eternity somehow involves a sequence of moments, if God experiences time, even in a very different way than we do, then his unchanging nature could get complicated because he'd be directly aware of different things at different times, so to speak. It's a very subtle point about how the nature of God's knowledge intertwines with the nature of time itself.
That's fascinating. It's an attempt to reconcile different aspects of God's nature that can seem contradictory, his complete knowledge and his unchanging being. The idea of direct versus indirect knowledge offers a potential way to have both. But as Craig points out, the success of this, well, it really hinges on how we understand God's relationship to time. It just highlights how interconnected these different theological ideas are. Your view on one thing, like the nature of eternity, can have massive implications for how you understand something else, like God's omniscience.
Right. Okay, now let's tackle fatalism head on. Craig dives into the logical systems of the philosopher prior and this concept of temporal necessity. If something will happen, does that make it necessary that it will happen? Unavoidable.
The core question.
Yeah. And here we encounter a distinction from medieval philosophy, necessitas consequentiae, which means a necessary consequence. Like the ground necessarily gets wet if it rains, the consequence is necessary, given the condition.
Okay, conditional necessity.
Right. Versus necessitas consequentis, the necessity of the consequent itself, meaning the ground must be wet, period, regardless of the rain, almost. Modern theological fatalists, Craig explains, try to argue for this second type of necessity. They do it by saying that past events, specifically God's foreknowledge or belief about the future, make future events necessary. The logic goes something like, God knew yesterday that I would do X today. His past knowledge is fixed, therefore I had to do X today.
And this is really where the rubber meets the road in the debate, isn't it? Between divine foreknowledge and human freedom. If that fatalistic argument holds, it seems to suggest our choices are just an illusion. If the entire future is already locked in place by God's past knowledge, how can we truly be free in our decisions? That distinction between the two types of necessity is absolutely crucial. Theologians often argue that while future events might follow as a consequence of God's foreknowledge, necessitas consequentiae, they aren't inherently necessary in and of themselves, necessitas consequentis.
Okay, so Booth tries to find a way out of this fatalistic trap. He argues that while God's belief about the future might be temporarily necessary, like, it was true in the past that God held this belief and the past is fixed.
Right. That fact about God's past mental state seems unchangeable.
Exactly. But Booth wants to say the actual event God believes in isn't necessarily temporally necessary. He wants to separate the necessity of the belief from the necessity of the thing believed. God's belief is fixed, but the future event is still open.
Okay. That sounds like a potential solution.
Well, Craig identifies a critical problem. Booth's argument seemed to assume that if God believes something, then it must be true. I mean, God's infallible, right?
Sure, that seems reasonable.
But if that's the case, Craig argues, then the foreknowledge argument just collapses back into a foretruth argument. The future is fixed simply because God's past beliefs about it are true and past truths are necessary. So unless Booth can provide a really clear definition of temporal necessity that allows for this separation between the belief and the event, well, his argument doesn't quite hold water. And Craig notes he doesn't really provide one.
Yeah, that really highlights the core challenge here. How do you affirm that God knows everything that will happen without that knowledge somehow forcing the future to unfold in a predetermined way, leaving no room for our free choices? Booth's attempt to draw a distinction is interesting, but as Craig points out, it struggles to avoid the implication that God's beliefs act as a kind of unchangeable blueprint for the future, which just brings back the problem of fatalism.
Right, so then Craig introduces Fredosso's Occamist solution to this logical fatalism. Ockhamism emphasizes what Freddosso calls the metaphysical primacy of the pure present. Basically, the idea is that propositions that depend on any time other than the immediate present aren't truly temporally necessary. Only the present is truly hard.
Okay, so the present moment has a special status.
Kind of. Freddosso talks about sub-moments, like the small slices of time, and how our shared past defines what possible worlds are like up to now. For Freddosso, something is temporally necessary. He calls it necessitas per accidens, necessity by accident, essentially. If it's true right now, and it stays true at all future moments in every possible world that had the exact same history up to this present moment. The crucial element here is this focus on the pure present as the only time about which we can have truly fixed hard facts. The key insight, I think, is that by emphasizing the present, Occamism tries to create a loophole in the idea that the past rigidly dictates the future. It leaves room for our choices to matter now.
That makes sense. The Occamist view offers a way to try and break that chain of necessity stretching from the past to the future. By focusing on the present moment as having this unique status, they argue that future contingent events, even if God foreknows them, aren't yet fixed in the same way that past events are fixed. This opens up the possibility of a future that isn't entirely predetermined, which is essential if we're going to have genuine freedom.
Now, Craig makes a pretty bold claim here. He argues that the problem of theological fatalism, the idea that God's foreknowledge specifically eliminates our freedom, can actually be boiled down to a purely logical fatalism, one that doesn't even need to bring God into the picture at all.
Oh, how does that work?
This logical fatalism would be based just on the temporal necessity of past tense statements about future events. For example, the statement, "It was the case yesterday that I will eat pizza tomorrow." Since the past is unchangeable, no one now can make it so that it wasn't the case yesterday that I would eat pizza tomorrow. That past fact seems fixed, and since it was the case that P seems to logically imply P, if it was true yesterday I'd eat pizza, then I will eat pizza, well, then it looks like my pizza eating tomorrow is already a necessary truth, just based on yesterday's truth. Craig's point is, if theological fatalism is a valid concern, then this purely logical form of fatalism is also a valid concern. And conversely, if this logical form can be shown to be flawed, then the case against divine foreknowledge specifically also weakens significantly.
Ah, I see. That's a very clever move in his overall argument. By reframing theological fatalism as a species of logical fatalism, he suggests the core issue isn't specifically about God or his knowledge, but rather about the fundamental nature of time and truth itself. If he can dismantle the logical argument, the one that relies just on the unalterability of past truths about the future, then the theological version loses a lot of its impact. It shifts the focus from the attributes of God to more basic questions about logic and how propositions about time actually work.
Okay, then we look at the fatalistic arguments put forward by the philosopher Taylor. These often revolve around the idea that we lack freedom or power if we're missing a necessary condition for an action. Like, if I need flour to bake bread and there's no flour, I can't bake bread.
Seems intuitive enough.
But Craig counters that the inability to do things that are logically impossible isn't a real restriction on our freedom. I can't draw a square circle, but that doesn't mean I'm not free. He points out that Taylor later seems to suggest a fatalism based on the idea that if a necessary condition for an action is absent, you simply can't perform that action. Craig's response is key. Many of these so-called necessary conditions, especially future ones, are actually consequences that depend on our present choices. It's a subtle but important distinction about what truly limits our ability to act.
Right. Taylor's reasoning taps into our intuitive sense that what we can do often depends on other things being in place. However, Craig rightly points out that many of these seemingly essential preconditions are themselves things we can influence through our choices now. To confuse a logical impossibility like trying to make 2 plus 2 equals 5 with a genuine constraint on our freedom is a key flaw in many fatalistic arguments. We aren't rendered unfree simply because we can't bring about logically contradictory states of affairs.
So some philosophers have tried to escape fatalism by attacking a really fundamental principle of logic, the principle of bivalence. That's the idea that every proposition, every statement is either true or false. No middle ground, no neither.
Okay, that sounds like a radical move.
It is. McCall offers such an argument, suggesting that for future contingent propositions, statements about future events that might or might not happen, like it will rain tomorrow, maybe neither truth nor falsehood currently applies. They're just indeterminate. But Craig points out that denying bivalence opens a whole can of worms. You have to specify. Are you proposing gaps in truth values? Some statements are neither true nor false. Or are you proposing a third truth value, like indeterminate? And either option can have really far-reaching consequences for your entire understanding of truth and logic. Susan Hack, as Craig notes, even argues that if you have a concept of truth in a logical system, it often implies bivalence unless you explicitly define truth in some multi-valued way.
Wow. Yeah, that highlights just how radical a move denying bivalence is. It's not a simple fix to the problem of fatalism. It requires a fundamental rethinking of our basic logical framework. As Craig and Hack discuss, opting for truth value gaps or introducing a third truth value has this ripple effect across our understanding of logic and the very nature of truth. It's a huge philosophical step, and it's definitely debatable whether the problem of future contingent events alone warrants such a drastic revision.
And speaking of multi-valued logic, Craig tackles a common misunderstanding. Just because logical systems can be built with more than two truth values doesn't somehow automatically disprove bivalence for normal language about the world. He stresses the crucial distinction between logical syntax, the formal structure, the rules of the system, and semantic interpretation, how we assign meaning and truth values to the elements within that system when we apply it.
Right. The map isn't the territory.
Exactly. Just because a logical system can handle three values doesn't mean that when we're talking about real-world propositions, everything isn't still ultimately either true or false. Now, Risher and Urquhart make a statement that Craig finds a bit confusing at first. They seem to suggest that the truth status of future contingent events depends on those future events without them being predetermined. But Craig interprets their eventual view as basically aligning with the idea that such propositions are timelessly either true or false after all.
That distinction between a mechanics of a logical system and how we use it to understand reality is key. A multi-valued logic can be a useful tool for certain purposes, sure, but it doesn't necessarily mean that the underlying reality it describes isn't still governed by the principle that every meaningful statement is either true or false. The core question remains whether future contingent statements, despite our uncertainty about them, have a definite truth value even now. And Risher and Urquhart, as Craig understands them, ultimately lean towards this idea of a timeless truth or falsity, which upholds bivalence while still acknowledging our limited knowledge about the future.
Interestingly, Pryor himself, the logician we mentioned earlier, seems to concede a point to those who defend bivalence later on. While he initially explored using three-value logic for future contingent statements, he later admitted that it makes sense to say that a contingent statement was true yesterday, even if no one knew it at the time.
Oh, really? Why did he concede that?
His reasoning was, basically, that without the actual event happening later, there wouldn't have been anything to make that statement definitively knowable back then. But in making this point, Craig argues, Pryor actually weakens his own argument against the idea that future contingent propositions could be true right now. It starts to seem like multi-valued logic might be more relevant for describing our knowledge about the future, our epistemic state, which is often uncertain, rather than the fundamental truth value, the metaphysical state, of future events.
Pryor's evolving views really highlight how difficult it is to definitively settle this issue. His admission that a future contingent statement could have been true in the past, even if unknown, suggests a recognition that truth and our knowledge of truth are two different things. That lends support to the idea that future contingent propositions might indeed have a definite truth value in the present, even if we lack the ability to determine what that value is. The focus then shifts, maybe, from the nature of reality itself to the limitations of our access to it.
Right. The Craig looks at Pryor's ideas about the reality of things that don't exist, like statements about Socrates. Pryor tried to reinterpret the possibility of statements like Socrates does not exist, not in terms of being possibly true, but as being possibly non-false.
Possibly non-false, what does that mean?
The idea is, in worlds where Socrates never existed, the statement Socrates exists isn't true, obviously. But Pryor wanted to say it isn't strictly false either, because there's simply no Socrates for the statement to be about, so it's non-false standards. Craig suggests that Pryor would likely apply a similar kind of analysis to future tense statements about individuals who don't exist yet. It's a complex, logical maneuver, really, trying to maintain consistency when dealing with things that aren't currently real.
Pryor's attempt to analyze statements about non-existent entities really reveals the deep connections between logic, existence, and truth. By focusing on this idea of possible non-falsehood, he's trying to avoid having to say that non-existent things have some kind of shadowy being in other possible scenarios. And Craig's suggestion that this approach might be extended to future tense statements about individuals highlights the philosophical challenge of grounding the truth of statements about what is not yet a reality.
Okay, this next one's a bit of a puzzle. The philosophers Lehrer and Taylor present a paradox involving someone named Smith who has the ability to arrive at force or zero. Their analysis highlights the difference between the time at which a possible event could occur, 4.0, and the time at which it's possible for that event to occur. Maybe Smith have the possibility all day long.
Okay, a subtle distinction.
Yeah, but Craig points out that their proposed solution, whatever it is, ironically seems to lead back to a kind of fatalism anyway. It ends up suggesting that we can never actually do anything other than what we, in fact, end up doing. Craig finds their whole analysis of what it means to can do something pretty problematic.
This paradox really illustrates the tricky nature of modal concepts like possibility and ability and how they relate to time. Lehrer and Taylor's attempt to resolve the puzzle about Smith's arrival time while focusing on the timing of possibility seems to inadvertently lead to a view where our actions seem constrained by what ultimately happens. Craig rightly identifies this fatalistic implication, showing how carefully we need to think about what it actually means to say someone can do something.
And Taylor, again, he puts forward an argument about our powerlessness when we lack a necessary condition for an action. We touched on this. Craig counters again that this is often a logical constraint rather than a real-world causal limitation. He uses the famous example of a sea battle tomorrow. If it's true now that there will be a sea battle tomorrow, then you can't now act in such a way that there won't be a sea battle tomorrow. But Craig says this doesn't show you lack power. It just shows you can't make a logical contradiction true, i.e. make it so that the battle both will and won't happen. It's not about a genuine lack of causal ability in a meaningful sense.
Right.
Craig effectively dismantles Taylor's argument by showing that it relies on logical necessity rather than any real limitation on our agency. The fact that we can't bring about a situation that contradicts a known truth doesn't mean we lack freedom in our choices. Taylor's argument, while seeming to be about our ability to act, ultimately boils down to the pretty uncontroversial point that we can't make logical impossibilities real. Then there's Wertheimer's analysis of what it means for one thing to be a condition of another. He emphasizes that the truth of a statement like P is a condition of Q can't be determined solely by looking at the truth values of P and Q, like in simple if P then Q logic. He stresses the important difference between necessary conditions, Q can't happen without P, and sufficient conditions. If P happens, Q is guaranteed. This just seems to highlight the complexities involved in understanding cause and effect relationships, which are obviously central to the free will debate.
Absolutely. Wertheimer's contribution reminds us that causality is more complex than just simple logical implication. Understanding the subtle differences between what's required for something to happen, necessary condition, and what guarantees it will happen, fulfilling condition, is crucial when analyzing arguments about determinism and freedom, as these often rely, sometimes fuzzily, on claims about what leads to what.
Okay, here's a mind-bending idea Craig discusses. Can we have the power to make future tense statements about the past true?
Say that again.
Okay, like, can you, right now, at this moment, make the statement, David is in Chicago, will be true at some past time day? Craig explains how seemingly having this kind of power over the past truth of future tense statements leads to logical contradictions. It seems to involve changing past truths about future possibilities, which gets very messy very quickly. It really makes you think about the fundamental directionality of time and our agency.
Wow. Yeah, that thought experiment really pushes us to consider the asymmetry of time and our ability to influence events. The logical problems that arise when we try to affect the truth value of past tense statements about the future really highlight the fixed nature of the past and the fact that our actions seem to operate forward in time, not backward.
Right. Then the philosopher Dummett uses indicative conditionals, simple if, then statements about what is the case to argue about fatalism. But Flew counters that, look, a cause can't logically come after its effect. Basic stuff. Craig points out that the real heart of the matter, especially for free will, lies with subjunctive conditionals, what would happen if, and counterfactual logic. Kahn further clarifies that a true fatalist isn't arguing from a future event back to a conditional future. They're arguing that we lack present power to prevent that future event from happening. Craig suggests Dummett's initial argument using only indicative conditionals might miss this crucial point about present powerlessness.
That exchange underscores the importance of using the right logical tools when analyzing these arguments. Subjunctive conditionals are essential for exploring alternative possibilities and the implications of our choices, which is what free will is all about. And Kahn's clarification of the fatalist's central claim that we lack the power now to change what will inevitably happen helps to keep the debate focused on the real issue, the extent of our agency in the face of a seemingly predetermined future.
Flew then presents what he calls a logical objection to backward causation. He argues it's basically a truth of logic, that an effect cannot precede its cause. He believes backward causation would necessarily involve changing the past, which he sees as strictly logically impossible, like creating a paradox.
Okay, so it's not just physically weird, he thinks it's logically contradictory.
That seems to be his view. While he kind of allows for the possibility of looking glass, precognition, like knowing the future as if looking in a mirror, maybe without causing it, he stands firm on this logical objection to actually causing the past.
Flew's argument rests on a very strong intuition most of us share about the fundamental directionality of cause and effect. The idea that an outcome could somehow precede its cause seems to violate a basic principle of how we understand the world to work. His concern that backward causation would logically require us to alter the past is a significant challenge for any theory that proposes retrocausality.
And adding to that, the philosopher Liu argues that the statement, no effect precedes its cause, might be ontologically necessary.
Ontologically necessary, meaning?
Meaning it's true in all metaphysically possible worlds, true about the fundamental nature of reality itself, even if its opposite isn't a straightforward logical contradiction like A and not A. This elevates the discussion about backward causation beyond just logical consistency to fundamental questions about the nature of reality. Is forward causation baked into the structure of being?
That's a big claim. Liu's contribution shifts the debate from the realm of pure logic to the deeper questions of metaphysics. By suggesting that the principle of causality's direction is a fundamental feature of reality, he strengthens the case against backward causation and compels us to consider the profound implications for how we understand the very structure of existence.
So is there any evidence for backward causation? Craig points out that there's really a lack of convincing evidence in various examples that have been proposed. These range from, Dummett's magic-based illustrations to Striven's psychic experiments or Chisholm and Taylor's scenarios involving chronologically posterior sufficient conditions. None seem very compelling. Craig suggests that when we say A causes B, we generally mean something more than just it's impossible for A to happen and B not to happen. There's usually an implication of temporal order.
Yeah, the examination of these purported instances of retrocausation highlights the real difficulty in finding clear, uncontroversial examples where an effect demonstrably comes before its cause. The weakness of the evidence presented in these various scenarios just reinforces the general skepticism surrounding the possibility of backward causation.
Okay, now things get a bit sci-fi. Craig discusses Feynman's reinterpretation of particle pair creation and annihilation in quantum physics.
Right, where an antiparticle moving forward in time looks like a particle moving backward.
Exactly. And the related concept of tachyons, hypothetical particles that would travel faster than light. Initially, tachyons were viewed with a lot of suspicion, partly because they seemed to open the door to causality violations, like the Tolman's paradox, where using tachyons could allow an effect to appear to happen before its cause from some observer's perspective.
Yeah, the introduction of tachyons takes the discussion into the realm of theoretical physics, where our everyday intuitions about cause and effect are really stretched thin. The paradoxes that arise from the very idea of faster-than-light travel underscore the deep connection between our understanding of time, causality, and the fundamental laws governing the universe.
So, to deal with the apparent backward causation that tachyons might imply, the reinterpretation principle was suggested. This principle basically says, okay, whenever you see what looks like a particle with negative energy moving backward in time, just reinterpret it as a particle with positive energy moving forward in time. Problem solved.
Seems like a bit of a semantic trick.
Well, that's the criticism Craig highlights. The direction of causality seems to be a fundamental aspect of reality. It's invariant. It doesn't change just because we relabel things. So this reinterpretation principle starts to look like maybe a form of self-deception, a way to avoid confronting the paradox rather than actually solving it.
Yeah. The reinterpretation principle highlights the strong desire within physics to preserve the principle of causality at all costs. However, as Craig notes, the idea that causal directionality is invariant suggests that simply changing our description of events might not be a sufficient way to resolve the paradoxes associated with things seeming to move backward in time or faster than light.
Interestingly, some people worry that the biggest problem with tachyonic backward causation wasn't logical paradox, but the implications for free will specifically, fatalism again. Feinberg raised concerns that if we could send signals into our own past, it might undermine our ability to make free choices because we'd know the outcome.
The classic time travel altering choices problem.
Kind of, but the counterargument, as Craig explains, is that even if you receive information from your future self, that doesn't erase the fact that your past action of sending, or deciding not to send, that information was still a free choice at that past time. Receiving the signal doesn't retroactively make the sending of it unfree.
That's a really important point when considering the potential implications of backward communication for free will. The mere ability to receive information from the future doesn't negate the fact that the past action that led to that information was still potentially a freely made decision. The temporal gap preserves a degree of independence between our past choices and any future knowledge we might gain.
Okay, shifting gears slightly. Craig notes that the expansion of the universe gives us this idea of a cosmic time, a kind of universal clock for the cosmos as a whole. This suggests a preferred frame of reference, which lends support to the A theory of time.
Remind us, A theory versus B theory.
Right. The A theory is the common sense view. The past is fixed, the future is open and potential, and the present now is objectively real and moves forward. The B theory, sometimes called the block universe view, says all moments in time, past, present, future, are equally real, and the flow of time is just a subjective illusion. So the existence of this cosmic time could potentially weaken fatalistic arguments that are sometimes drawn from Einstein's special theory of relativity, which emphasizes the relativity of simultaneity and seems more aligned with the B theory.
Got it. The concept of cosmic time provides a compelling challenge to the B theory of time and its potential fatalistic implications. If there is a universal now, defined by the very structure of the universe, it lends support to the A theory and its distinction between a fixed past and an open future, which aligns more naturally with our intuition of free will.
Craig also briefly touches on parapsychological evidence, like Sol's famous card-guessing experiments from the mid-20th century that seem to suggest precognition knowing the future.
ESP and that sort of thing.
Yeah. However, he acknowledges, look, the evidence for precognition is really not clear-cut. It's ambiguous and could potentially be explained by other paranormal phenomena, if you believe in those, or perhaps even just chance or methodological issues. So, not a strong pillar for arguments about knowing the future.
Right. The inclusion of parapsychological evidence shows the wide range of topics that touch on our ability to know the future. But the lack of definitive, universally accepted evidence for precognition means we need to be pretty cautious about drawing any firm conclusions from it regarding the debate on fatalism or foreknowledge.
Okay, then we get into the really fun stuff, the self-inhibiting paradoxes of time travel, like the classic grandfather paradox.
Yeah.
Going back in time to prevent your own birth or, well, kill your grandfather before he meets your grandmother.
Right. Seems logically impossible.
It does. Dr. Horwich offers one way of thinking about these, but Craig highlights the often bizarre and counterintuitive implications that seem to follow if time travel were possible, like the idea that the very structure of space-time might somehow have to conspire to prevent you from creating a paradox, maybe by making your gun jam or having you slip on a banana peel. It raises some truly strange questions about cause, effect, and logical consistency.
The paradoxes of time travel serve as powerful thought experiments, don't they? They expose potential logical inconsistencies that could arise if we were actually able to interact with the past. The idea that the structure of space-time itself might have to be self-consistent, perhaps influenced by the actions of time travelers, as Craig points out, just underscores the profound and often mind-bending consequences of altering the temporal order of events.
Craig then presents a more formal, logical argument against the possibility of time travel. He suggests that if time-like loops, like going back in time and meeting your past self, are metaphysically possible, it leads to contradictions if certain other seemingly possible actions, like building a time machine in the first place, are also possible.
So the possibility of the loop itself rules out the possibility of the actions needed to enter it.
Something like that. The core idea seems to be that the existence of these loops might logically rule out the very possibility of actions that could create self-contradictory situations within those loops. If you could build the machine, you'd create a paradox, therefore you can't build the machine, maybe. It's tricky logic.
Yeah, that logical argument attempts to demonstrate an inherent incompatibility between the existence of closed time loops and the possibility of certain kinds of free actions. The idea is that the potential for creating paradoxes within time loops might necessitate constraints on what actions are even possible in such a scenario, thus casting doubt on the very coherence of time travel itself.
He then discusses a related counterfactual argument. Even if time loops somehow existed, the possibility of, say, building a rocket capable of reaching the loop entrance might be incompatible with that scenario. Because building the rocket could lead to a situation within the time loop that creates a contradiction. So if the loop exists, the rocket building must be impossible. It's another way of exploring what conditions must hold in a world where time travel is possible and finding them perhaps contradictory.
The counterfactual argument shifts the focus to what would happen under hypothetical circumstances in a world with time loops. By showing that seemingly plausible free actions could lead to logical inconsistencies within such a framework, it strengthens the philosophical case against the actual possibility of time travel.
So, bringing it back to the A theory of time, Craig explains that someone who believes in the A theory sees the past as something that has become real, actualized, while the future is still just potential, not yet fixed. This view naturally explains why causation only seems to work forward in time. You can't cause something that isn't real yet.
Right, the asymmetry is built in.
Exactly. He connects this idea to the fact that we have traces of past events reaching us now, like light from distant stars. But there's no similar trace reaching us from the future. This aligns with the argument by Waterloo that we can't sort of continue backward in time in the same way we continue forward. The nature of time itself on this view dictates the direction of causality.
The A theory of time provides a very intuitive explanation for the asymmetry of causation, doesn't it? The ontological distinction between a fixed, actual past and a potential, unreal future makes the idea of an effect preceding its cause seem fundamentally backward, almost nonsensical, as there would be no actual future event to be the cause of a present or past occurrence.
Then the philosopher Broad makes an interesting distinction. He talks about post-perception, where we perceive an event after it has happened through some causal chain, light hitting our eyes, sound waves reaching our ears.
Normal perception.
Right. And he contrasts that with precognition, where we seem to know about a future event that hasn't yet occurred and therefore can't have caused our knowledge through any normal chain. Broad argues that if precognition isn't a form of perception, since there's no causal chain from the future, then it's epistemologically, in terms of how we note it, more similar to retrocognition, knowing the past, without a direct causal link, like maybe through some trace or memory. However, Craig points out that for someone who believes in the A theory of time, where the future isn't real yet, the causal objection to precognition remains a very serious one. How can you know something that doesn't exist?
Broad's distinction highlights the different challenges we face in understanding how we know about the past versus how we might know about the future. While retrocognition, at least in theory, could involve some kind of causal trace left over from the past, precognition, especially for an atheist who sees the future as not yet real, lacks any clear causal mechanism. That raises significant questions about its plausibility.
And Craig reiterates the idea we touched on with Lou, that the statement, an effect cannot precede its cause, might be a synthetic a priori truth, meaning it's a fundamental truth about reality, synthetic, that we know independently of or prior to specific experiences, a priori. This reinforces the strong philosophical intuition most people have against the possibility of backward causation.
Right. By classifying the principle of causal directionality as potentially a synthetic a priori truth, Craig is arguing that it's not just a matter of observation or how we happen to talk, but maybe a fundamental and necessary truth about how the world actually works.
So Craig wraps up this whole long discussion on fatalism by emphasizing a crucial point. The necessity of the past comes from our inability to cause past events to have been different. It's a causal limitation. It's not about any logical or counterfactual impossibility of them having been different. If things had gone differently, the past would be different. But we do seem to have the power to cause future events. And that's why we intuitively experience the future as open and full of possibilities, unlike the fixed past. It's a crucial distinction for understanding the nature of our agency.
That conclusion provides a really clear and important distinction. While we can't go back and change what has happened, our lack of power over the past is primarily a causal limitation, not necessarily a logical one. Our agency, our ability to make things happen, is directed forward in time, and the future remains, in some important sense, open to the consequences of the choices we make in the present.
And just to hammer it home, Craig revisits Taylor's misunderstanding of what it means for something to be within one's power. He stresses again that many of the supposed necessary conditions for future events are themselves dependent on our present actions. This reinforces the point that fatalistic arguments often stumble because they misunderstand the relationship between our choices now and the conditions that enable or prevent future outcomes.
Exactly. By returning to Taylor's initial presupposition, Craig again highlights a common error in fatalistic thinking: the failure to recognize that many of the things that seem like necessary prerequisites for future events are actually contingent on the choices we make in the here and now.
Okay, so having dealt with fatalism in general, how does this apply back to God's foreknowledge? Craig explains the counterfactual solution. Core idea is, if a person were to freely choose to act differently than they actually will, then God's foreknowledge of that action would have been different.
So God's knowledge tracks our free choices rather than determining them.
That's the idea. God knows what we will freely do. But if we were genuinely free to do otherwise, then had we done otherwise, God would have known that instead. Craig addresses an objection from Pike, who argued this clashes with God's essential infallibility. God can't possibly hold a false belief. But Craig clarifies, the issue isn't whether God could have held a false belief. Molinists agree he couldn't. The issue is whether someone can act in such a way that God would have held a different but still true belief corresponding to that different action.
That's a subtle but crucial clarification. The counterfactual solution offers a way to reconcile God's perfect knowledge of the future with our genuine freedom by emphasizing the conditional nature of that knowledge. God knows what we will freely do, and if we were to make a different choice, his knowledge would simply reflect that alternative possibility accurately. This avoids the implication that God's knowledge somehow forces our actions.
But it's not quite that simple, is it? The philosopher Fisher introduces a distinction between hard facts and soft facts. Hard facts are facts purely about the past that are unchangeable now, like Caesar crossed the Rubicon. Soft facts are facts that might be grammatically about the past or present, but whose truth depends on what will happen in the future, like yesterday was the day before the sea battle.
Okay, so some facts about the past aren't entirely hard.
Right. And Fisher then argues that God's beliefs about future contingent events are a tricky kind of hybrid, a hard type soft fact. They seem hard because God having a belief is an event that happened in the past or is true timelessly, depending on your view of God's relation to time, and that past state seems fixed. But they're soft because the content of the belief is about the future. And Fisher worries that the hardness of God having the belief might still preclude human freedom, even if the content is counterfactually dependent. It's a more nuanced challenge.
Fisher's distinction between hard and soft facts definitely raises a sophisticated challenge. Even if God's foreknowledge is counterfactually dependent on our choices, the fact remains that God did have, or timelessly has, those beliefs. That seems like an unchangeable fact about the past or God's state. Fisher argues that this hardness, the fixity of God possessing that belief, might still constrain our future freedom, acting like a fixed point we can't deviate from.
So what's the response? The alchemist's response to this, Craig notes, is essentially to deny that God's belief about a future contingent event is a truly hard fact about the past. Even though it's a fact involving a property God has, the property of believing X, its truth is grounded in the future contingent event. If that future event is genuinely contingent, then the past fact of God believing it isn't fixed in the same way as facts that depend only on the past. This attempts to undermine Fisher's argument by saying that God's beliefs about the contingent future don't have the same kind of unchangeable, freedom-canceling status as, say, the fact that the Battle of Hastings happened in 1066.
Right. The alchemist perspective directly challenges Fisher's claim by arguing that the temporal dependence of God's belief on future free choices means that it doesn't possess the same kind of fixed, hard status as purely past facts. This allows them to maintain the possibility of human freedom even in the face of divine foreknowledge, by insisting that facts about God's mind concerning future contingents remain, in a crucial sense, soft.
Craig also briefly mentions Plantinga's attempt to define temporal necessity using counterfactuals, but notes that there are potential difficulties and complexities with his specific formulation. It just goes to show how challenging it is to get a really precise definition of this fundamental concept of past necessity.
Plantinga's effort to define temporal necessity rigorously highlights the inherent difficulty in capturing our intuitive understanding of what it means for something to be necessarily true at or because of a specific point in the past. The issues he apparently encountered just underscore the need for careful and nuanced definitions in this whole area.
Craig then suggests a possible reinterpretation of Fredosso's alchemist idea of temporal indifference. Remember that?
Vaguely. The idea that some propositions aren't tied to a specific time.
Kind of. Craig proposes that maybe a proposition should only be considered temporally indifferent if it would remain true, even if the entire future were annihilated right after the present moment. This would exclude any propositions whose truth depends in any way on future events, including God's beliefs about them if they depend on the future. It offers another way to refine our understanding of temporal necessity in a way that strongly protects human freedom.
Interesting. That proposed reinterpretation aims to create a clearer and more restrictive definition of temporal indifference, one that more closely aligns with the intuition that only those propositions that are entirely independent of future contingent events should be considered truly fixedly necessary because of the past. This would further safeguard the idea that the future is genuinely open.
Craig also explains that while someone like David Lewis is correct in saying we can't efficiently cause the past to be different, we can't go back and make Caesar not cross the Rubicon.
Right, no changing history.
Many past facts, including God's foreknowledge, if he is essentially omniscient and knows future contingents, are counterfactually dependent on the present, meaning if the present were different, then those past facts, like God's beliefs, would have been different. It's a subtle but important distinction about the different ways the past and present can be related, causally fixed, but perhaps counterfactually flexible.
Lewis's distinction between our inability to causally change the past and the fact that many past truths might have been different if the present had unfolded differently is crucial. While we can't alter what has happened, the truth of past statements, particularly those concerning knowledge or beliefs about the future, can indeed be counterfactually dependent on our present choices.
And then the philosopher Mavrose introduces this idea of vestigial modalities.
Vestigial modalities, like an appendix.
Huh, sort of. He uses it to explain why some statements about the past seem necessary, why they feel so fixed. He argues that these apparent necessities often don't reflect actual limitations on our present power or freedom. They're like leftover traces of necessity from a time when things could have been different, but now they're set. It's a way of suggesting that some of our intuitions about the past's unchangeability might be a bit misleading when we're thinking about constraints on the present.
That's a neat concept. Maverd's idea of vestigial modalities suggests that some of our seemingly necessary statements about the past might be more about how we talk about the past or the perspective from which we view it now than about actual constraints on our current ability to act freely regarding the future. This helps to perhaps soften the apparent rigidity of the past in relation to our present choices and their future consequences.
Newcomb's paradox is briefly mentioned too. This is a classic puzzle in decision theory. You might have heard of it.
The two boxes, the predictor.
Yeah, right. It's relevant to the discussion of theological fatalism because it explores the implications of making choices when you believe there's a being, the predictor, with perfect predictive ability, something obviously analogous to divine foreknowledge. It really makes you think about how we make rational decisions when we suspect our choices might already be known, or even causally linked to the predictor's past action.
Absolutely. Newcomb's paradox is a fascinating thought experiment that forces us to confront the implications of perfect foreknowledge on rational decision-making. The dilemma it presents really highlights the tension between predictability and free choice, which is, of course, a central theme in the debate about divine foreknowledge.
LaCroix raises the question of whether it even makes sense for God to foreknow his own future decisions. If he's truly free, can his future choices be known objects for him now?
That's an interesting internal question for theism.
It is. But Quinn cautions against simply applying the limitations of human decision-making processes, where we often don't know what we'll choose until we choose it to an omniscient being. It's a good reminder that we need to be careful when we try to understand divine attributes using our limited human perspectives in psychology.
That's a fair point. It underscores the unique nature of divine omniscience. Our experience of making decisions as finite beings, deliberating over time, might not be directly applicable to an infinite, timeless, and all-knowing God. LaCroix's concern is understandable from a human standpoint, but Quinn rightly points out the potential for making category errors when we try to impose our cognitive limitations onto divine attributes.
Craig also briefly mentions Gettier problems. These are famous philosophical puzzles from the 1960s concerning the traditional definition of knowledge as justified true belief.
Right, where you can have a justified true belief by accident, basically.
Exactly. Gettier showed you could have a belief that's true, and you have good reasons for it, but it's still not really knowledge because the justification is flawed or coincidental. One proposed solution, Craig notes, is simply to deny that someone can have adequate evidence or justification for a belief that turns out to be false. While this might seem a bit off topic, it actually touches on the very nature of knowledge and justification, which is central to the discussion of divine foreknowledge. What does it mean for God to know? Is it just true belief or something more?
Yeah, the mention of Gettier problems reminds us of the complexities involved in defining what it even means to know something, even for us humans. These paradoxes highlight the distinction between simply having a justified belief that happens to be true and actually having genuine knowledge. This distinction is also relevant when we consider the nature and reliability of divine foreknowledge. Is God's knowledge immune to Gettier-style problems? Presumably yes, but how?
Okay, finally, we delve into Molinism and the idea of middle knowledge, or scientia media. This is a really influential concept developed by the Jesuit theologian Luisa Molina back in the 16th century. The core idea is that God knows all the true counterfactuals of creaturely freedom.
Counterfactuals of creaturely freedom, meaning?
Meaning, God knows what every possible free creature would freely do in any possible situation or circumstance they could be placed in. And crucially, Molinists believe God knows this logically prior to his decision, his decree, to create any particular world. It's knowledge he has before he chooses what to actualize.
Okay, so it's between his knowledge of necessary truths and his knowledge of what he will create.
It's middle knowledge. And this allows God, the theory goes, to providentially plan the world, guiding it towards his desired ends through the foreseen free choices of human beings, without actually causing those choices or determining them. It's presented as a powerful way to reconcile robust divine sovereignty and meticulous providence with genuine human freedom. And it's contrasted with the idea of simple foreknowledge, where God just knows the actual future, and also with Thomistic views that often emphasize God's causal role more strongly.
Molinism offers a really sophisticated and, yeah, influential attempt to harmonize divine foreknowledge, sovereignty, and human freedom. The concept of middle knowledge, God's pre-creation knowledge of what free creatures would choose to do in any given circumstance, provides a potential mechanism for detailed divine providence without resorting to theological determinism. It posits this crucial intermediary stage in God's knowledge between his inherent understanding of possibilities and his active will to create the actual world.
Now, it wasn't without its critics, even early on. The philosopher Suarez offered an argument against middle knowledge, partly based on the law of excluded middle, the idea that every proposition, including these counterfactuals, must be either true or false before the choice is made. But another thinker, Giraud, provided responses. Giraud focused on the idea that the truth of propositions about contingent things, things that don't have to be the way they are, ultimately depends on the free determination of the agents involved. The truth is grounded in the agent's will. This just highlights that there's still ongoing debate and different theological perspectives on the coherence and reality of middle knowledge.
Right. The exchange between Suarez and Guerra illustrates the philosophical challenges and theological nuances surrounding the doctrine of middle knowledge. Suarez is concerned about whether all these myriad counterfactuals of freedom can be definitively true or false before God decrees anything, highlights some of the logical and metaphysical complexities. While Guerra's response emphasizes the core libertarian idea that the truth about contingent future actions is grounded in the agent's free will itself.
Robert Adams, a more contemporary philosopher, also raised objections. He argued that true counterfactual statements about what would happen if something else were the case, usually take the probabilistic form of, if it were the case that P, then it would probably be the case that Q, and are often expressed using indicative sentences. He doubted that these very specific counterfactuals of freedom could be definitively true or false.
So he's skeptical about the certainty attached to these would counterfactuals about free choices.
Exactly. But the Molinist counter to this, as Craig explains, is that certainty is really an epistemic property. It's about our state of knowledge or confidence. It's not necessarily a requirement for the truth of the counterfactual statement itself. A counterfactual might be true even if we could never be certain about it. It's a debate about how we should properly understand and evaluate counterfactual claims, especially those involving freedom.
Adlers's probabilistic view of counterfactuals certainly contrasts with the standard Molinist understanding, which typically assumes a definite non-probabilistic truth value, either true or false, for counterfactuals of creaturely freedom. The Molinist argument that certainty is an epistemic property, separate from the ontological truth of the counterfactual, is key to their defense.
And Molinists argue strongly that for any genuine counterfactual of freedom, like if person P were instantiated in circumstances C at time T and left free with respect to action A, the instantiation of P would freely do A. Either that statement or its negation would not freely do A must be true. One or the other reflects what that possible person's free choice would be. Importantly, they argue that the truth of such counterfactuals doesn't require any kind of causal connection or determination between the if part, the circumstances, and the then part, the free action. That would defeat the purpose.
Right. The Molinist concept of counterfactuals of freedom really underscores the core libertarian idea that free choices, by their very nature, are not causally necessitated or determined by prior events or circumstances. The truth of these counterfactuals reflects the agent's disposition or inclination to choose in a given situation, but crucially, even in the absence of a determining cause. The choice originates with the agent.
So Adams then raises the million-dollar question. What makes these counterfactuals of freedom true? If they aren't caused, what grounds their truth?
Yeah, where does the truth value come from?
Plantinga, another key defender of Molinism, responds partly by suggesting that, look, it's actually clearer that some counterfactuals of freedom are possibly true than it is that all truths need some further independent grounding factor we can point to. He also points out that we often accept counterfactuals about God himself, like if God had willed X, he would have done Y, without demanding such a grounding. Y demanded only for creaturely counterfactuals. Ultimately, Craig aligns with the view that the truth of counterfactuals, just like any other statement that isn't true purely by definition, analytic, or logic, is grounded simply in their correspondence with reality in this case, the reality of what free creatures would do in various possible circumstances.
The debate about what grounds the truth of counterfactuals of freedom delves into really fundamental questions about metaphysics and epistemology. Plantinga's point about the intuitive plausibility of some counterfactuals and the analogy to counterfactuals about God challenges the demand for a strict causal or deterministic explanation for their truth. And Craig's appeal to the straightforward idea that truth simply corresponds to reality, however complex that reality might be, offers perhaps the most direct account of their truth conditions, avoiding the need for some mysterious extra truth maker.
And crucially, the Molinists argue the very truth of these counterfactuals of freedom presupposes the reality of agent causation.
Agent causation.
This is the philosophical idea that a free agent, a person, a self, can be the genuine originating cause of their own choice or action, without that choice being ultimately determined by some chain of prior causes, like brain states, desires, beliefs, etc. The agent starts the causal chain of their action. This really highlights the libertarian foundation of Molinism, the belief that we have genuine freedom to initiate our actions, to be the ultimate source of what we do.
That makes sense. The doctrine of agent causation is absolutely central to the Molinist understanding of freedom. It posits a real power in free agents to initiate actions without being causally determined by prior factors. And this is essential for the truth of those counterfactuals of freedom that describe what agents would freely do precisely because they are the originators of those actions.
So Craig concludes his discussion on middle knowledge by saying that, despite debates, it seems to be a possible and potentially compelling way to understand both divine providence, God's guidance of the world, and the reality of human freedom. Even though, he notes, its ability to fully explain the mechanics of divine prescience, exactly how God knows the future, including these counterfactuals, might be somewhat limited. It's more about reconciling concepts than explaining the divine mind's inner workings.
Yeah, Craig's assessment of middle knowledge highlights its considerable strengths in addressing the classic, thorny problem of reconciling divine sovereignty and human free will. While acknowledging potential limitations or remaining questions and fully explaining the nature of divine prescience itself, he clearly views Molinism as a coherent and philosophically significant theological framework that offers a powerful solution.
Okay, finally, in an appendix to the book, Craig explores a fascinating parallel in, of all places, physics. The question of whether Einstein's special theory of relativity implies fatalism.
Relativity implies fatalism.
Well, the philosopher Hilary Putnam famously argued that it does. His argument was based mainly on the relativity of simultaneity, the fact that in relativity, what one observer considers happening now simultaneously, another observer moving relative to the first might see as happening in the past or future. Putnam argued this lack of a universal now, this lack of a privileged observer, suggests that all events in space-time, past, present, future, are equally real, which sounds a lot like the B theory of time, the block universe. And if the future is just as real as the past, that sounds a lot like fatalism.
Wow. The parallel drawn with the special theory of relativity offers a really surprising and thought-provoking new dimension to the debate. Putnam's argument suggests that the very structure of space-time, as described by relativity, might itself imply a deterministic or fatalistic view of reality, where all events are equally real, regardless of their temporal relation to any particular observer.
However, Craig points out that relativity can maybe also be seen as an argument against fatalism, or at least against the specific arguments used in theological fatalism. Think about it. Just as one observer's present in relativity can include events that another observer considers their future, and this first observer still seems to have the causal power to influence those future events by, say, sending a light signal that intercepts them.
Okay.
So, too, perhaps, might humans have the power to affect the events that God foreknows from his temporal or timeless perspective.
Yeah.
If fatalism were correct based only on the past fixing the future, then the future event in relativity should be just as fixed by the observer's past perception of it as God's past belief fixes our future actions. But it doesn't seem to work that way in the physics.
That's a clever inversion. This counterargument challenges the fatalistic interpretation of relativity by drawing an analogy back to the foreknowledge debate. The fact that an observer can seemingly interact with and influence events in another observer's relative future suggests that even within a relativistic framework, the future might not be entirely fixed and predetermined in the way required by simple fatalistic arguments.
And then, tying back to something we mentioned earlier, Craig notes that the discovery of cosmic time, linked to the expansion of the universe, offers a potential counter-argument to the fatalistic implications drawn from special relativity specifically. This cosmic time suggests a universal, shared frame of reference, which could favor the A theory of time with its distinct past, present, and future, potentially undermining the B theory block universe idea that all moments are equally real.
Right.
The reemergence of the concept of cosmic time in cosmology provides a potential way to resolve the tension with fatalistic interpretations based purely on special relativity. By suggesting a fundamental universal now, defined by the large-scale structure of the universe, it lends support back to a view of time that distinguishes between a fixed past and an open future, which is, of course, much more compatible with our intuitive idea of free will.
Well, that was a truly deep dive, wasn't it, into the complex, long-debated relationship between divine foreknowledge and human freedom. We've navigated a pretty vast landscape of philosophical arguments, theological doctrines, and even dipped our toes into some fascinating, maybe unexpected areas of logic and physics.
Yeah, what's abundantly clear is that this is not a simple issue with easy answers, not at all.
Yeah.
As we've explored, thinkers have wrestled with these questions for centuries, from logical, metaphysical, and even scientific perspectives, examining the very nature of time, truth, possibility, causality, and our own agency. We've touched on everything from the intricacies of logical fatalism and temporal necessity, to the nuances of counterfactual reasoning, the complexities of middle knowledge, and those surprising parallels found in the theory of relativity, all stemming from Dr. Craig's comprehensive exploration. Hopefully you, the learner, now have a much clearer understanding of the key concepts involved, the arguments and counterarguments, and the profound implications of this enduring debate.
Absolutely. And this leaves us with a final thought to perhaps ponder. Given the potential for a universal now suggested by modern cosmology and cosmic time, how should that influence our understanding of the interplay between divine foreknowledge and our human capacity for free choice? Does it strengthen the case for compatibility? Or perhaps are our persistent intuitions about fatalism, the feeling that foreknowledge must negate freedom, simply a reflection of our inherent limitations in fully grasping the true nature of time, causality, and maybe even omniscience itself? These are the kinds of questions that invite further exploration and certainly deeper reflection.